Do you know Edgar Allan Poe? Famous American horror author, lived relatively short period of time, had a strange and eventful life. His stories are very famous in American literature, and he was one of the best American cryptographers of the 1800s. So for 2 years, he wrote columns about how to crack monoalphabetic substitution ciphers, and he bragged that he could crack anything that anyone could encrypt, which may have been true, may have been a gimmick he was using. But readers would send in things that they had encrypted, and he would write it out and give the original message, and people were really impressed by this. He did this because it made much better money than the horror fiction that he was writing. And based on this, he wrote his most popular story, which is called The Gold Bug. But it was very famous. He earned $100 for it. It was the first time. So we have this historical development. Al-Kindi wrote the first book about cryptography. And now, almost 1,000 years later, we have the first time that cryptography is appearing in a fictional work. And if you think about it, cryptography is a very common plot device, like Mission Impossible, NCIS. There are lots of things that mention cryptography. This was the first time someone used it in a work where it was fictional. And in it, he lays out, so the whole plot, spoiler alert, sorry, the whole plot hinges on decrypting this message. And the whole story is basically how they decrypted this message. And so one of the characters says, I assume the cryptograph to be English. You observe there are no divisions between the words. So all the spaces were deleted. And if you're going to send a message, you should do that. So you should always delete the spaces if you want to keep something secret. And it makes it much harder if the spaces are gone. Because he says, for instance, if he saw a one-letter word, he would know right away that it was A or I. And that would have given him a good. So then he did a frequency table of the characters in the text, which is, of course, what you actually do. You count, and you may not need to actually go in and count, but you can just see kind of which ones are the most popular. The character 8 appears 33 times. The semicolon appears 26 times. The character 4 appears 19 times. Plus dot and right parenthesis all appear 16 times, etc. He said, I'm going to do the frequency analysis and say, well, these probably correspond to the most common letters. And then that's how he solved it. And actually, it's weird because he's trying to teach this method inside a short story. So he says lots of things like the most frequent letters, and he totally messes this up. He totally messes this up. This is terrible. These are not the most common letters. Like, he's right about E, A, O, and I, but then the vowels are just a disaster. I mean, the consonants are just a disaster. Yeah, H is way too high and T is way. Think about Wheel of Fortune, the letters they give people for free, and those are the most common letters. So he actually did this because he got his frequency information from Latin and then just assumed it was the same in English for some reason. Yeah, no. So then he guesses that 8 is E. And the other reason he guesses 8 is E is because E appears in pairs a lot. You see 2 E's together. And in the original message, you see 2 8s together a few times. He makes the guess that 8 is E, and that's his byte. And then he keeps going, and then he tries to guess which he guesses is semicolon 4 8. And so then he thinks the semicolon is T, the H is 4, and the 8 is E. And then you just go from there. And eventually he solves it using the same method you all solved. But his frequency table is a disaster. And thankfully, it's kind of fortunate. So like some really great cryptographers learned about cryptography from this story. William Friedman, who was one of the really great American cryptographers of World War II, learned about cryptography and became interested in it from this story. But it's like you learn about math, and on the first page it says 2 + 2 is 5. It's really jarring. So you don't have to replace letters with letters. You don't have to replace letters with English letters. There are basically no rules at all. You can replace letters with dancing people. You can replace letters with things like this. So this is the last method that we'll look at. You write the alphabet out like this in a grid, and then when you write it in the second grid, you put dots around. And then you write it in a cross, and you write it in a cross with dots. And that gives you 26 different symbols that you can use. So then to replace A, you would replace A with just this corner that it looks like, with this portion of the square. So using this method, you get messages that look like this. And this is still considered monoalphabetic substitution because you're replacing, each letter is only replaced with one thing. But there are two alphabets that are actually in play. There's the English alphabet, and then there's this symbol pattern thing.